So welcome to the final part of the build series for my Demon Mech, which I'm building for the original Mecha contest. So as you can see, we now have a finished, completed, painted mech, complete with LEDs and a base and all the rest of it. Now, I've got to say this thing really has grown in complexity over the course of the project. I guess that's part and parcel of taking part in a competition. You kind of want to bring your A game to this, and so that's a good thing, I think, because it does sort of drive you to push yourself a little bit further than you probably would if this were just a project for yourself. So to be honest, if this was one that I was just making for myself, I possibly may have called it quits halfway through here and sort of said, well, you know, that's good enough. I can't spend forever on it. But having that deadline, having that sort of a competitive aspect to the project, I did find that it helped me drive a bit further than I normally would and sort of push beyond the point that I might have quit previously. So that's all for the good, I think. And so hopefully that comes across in the final product here. So in this part of the video we're going to be going through the final painting of this, also some of the wiring and LED setup that I put in, and also some of the details that I've put into the base. Now, one thing that I didn't really think through when I was making this is how the hell am I actually going to paint it. Now, obviously I've just built this thing up from scratch and kept adding bits as I went. And what that's meant is that I've got a big conglomeration of pieces here. Something that I found with previous projects is me and the people watching me build them have sort of got used to some of the colours of the resin. So in this case I've got white and black resin. And certainly on previous projects people have sort of commented that they actually missed the original colours that the robot was in. I think partly because those were the sort of colours that they'd seen the robot as for many months as I built it. So when I finally come to paint it and paint it a completely different colour to the base colours of the resin, it suddenly looked a bit different to people. And certainly with this one I sort of got used to seeing the black and the white, and so I decided that I didn't want to lose that. So I've decided to actually retain some of the black plastic and resin where I can, and only paint certain parts of it where I need to. So what I'm doing here is just masking up the robot so I can start off painting the first piece. And what I've got is this mechanical element on the back. So what I'm doing is just giving it a undercoat of white paint, and then I'm just coming in with some yellow lacquer spray. I always like the idea of having a little bit of sort of industrial colouring to these things. A frequent colour scheme I've used is orange and white, because it's got a sort of an industrial look to it. It's the sort of colour you might see, I don't know, Coast Guard ships in perhaps, or sort of industrial machinery. So I think that's quite good for a robot, as it sort of invokes that sort of industrial feel. Now the robot itself, of course, is made up of a mixture of parts, some of which I want to paint and some of which I don't. So I'm having to be quite careful here. What I would normally do is just undercoat the whole thing and paint it all from scratch. But because there's some metal elements in here that I want to retain the colour of, and also some conduits and some of the black plastic as well, I can't really do that. So what I'm doing is just coming in with a paintbrush and just painting the elements I need to, and being careful not to get paint on any of the elements that I want to keep. Now you can see that particularly here for the main body. I've got metal cables running through all of these pieces and a variety of other shapes which are white resin. So I'm having to be quite careful here and just making sure that I don't get paint on the elements that I want to keep. Now for the main body, a lot of it already is white, but I want to make sure that I have a consistent colour to it, and also that any weathering that I put on sort of adheres to the model correctly. So what I'm doing is giving it all a coat of white undercoat, and then coming in again with some lacquers, and that just gives me a nice smooth finish. The cool thing with the lacquers is that they don't tend to react with things like isopropyl alcohol or white spirit, so I can easily use some solvents to clean off any weathering that I add to the colour as well. Obviously white picks up dirt quite easily, so you need to be quite subtle with the weathering, just so it's not too overpowering in the finished piece. Now for some further mechanical detailing on this leg section, I've got these round sections which come from hard drives, and I can't remember if I deliberately made these resin shapes to fit these, but that fits in quite nicely like that, so I think that's quite a nice additional detail. So for the weathering I'm using oil paint, so I'm just thinning that down with some white spirit. So the idea here is that you put the paint into the corners of the detail and then just use the white spirit to thin it out and let it run through the details. You can then wipe the excess away and that leaves quite a nice subtle weathering effect. I'm also adding some metallics along the edges, and that's to simulate some chipped paint. While I really do like the latex masking technique that I've used previously, it's a lot of setup to get that working correctly, so just adding a little bit of chipping to the edges is a much quicker way of getting a very nice weathering effect. Obviously I could do something that was really rusted and beaten up, but I have to sort of rein myself in. I really love doing the sort of weathered look, the really beaten up look, but it's tempting to make every single mech you build rusted and sort of beaten up and completely screwed. And you know, while some mechs are going to be that way, obviously these are meant to be functioning pieces of technology, so I try and resist that impulse to make them completely destroyed, and so just have a little bit of weathering here and there. Something that I found myself using quite a lot is this, and this is a Sharpie, but it's a metallic Sharpie, so it's just quite a bright sort of silver colour. And I've actually found this a really useful way of adding additional weathering to mechanical pieces, because you can just draw on the edge and easily add some silver detail. So that's quite a nice way of just having some chipped paint effects, and a very quick way of doing it. So I found myself using this quite a lot on this project. So something that sort of came to me as I was walking down the road, I happened to walk past a car which had some really cool looking brake pads. They were like yellow against a black finish, and I thought they looked really, really cool. So I started thinking, well, maybe I could incorporate those into my robot. So what I've done is to make up this curved piece with just some mechanical detailing on it, and obviously I've made a mould and cast up a bunch of copies. So what I'm going to do is paint these the same industrial yellow that I'd used previously on the robot. So I've let those dry, and I'm now coming in and adding some metallic detail and then adding some weathering on top of that to give it a bit of a weathered, beaten up look. Right, so they're going to sit on the back of the sort of pivot points like this. I think that's quite a nice little detail to it. So I've added these to all of the joints on the legs. And the idea is that there may be just a brake or a bracket to allow the leg to lock in place if it needs to. So for the base I want to have a little bit of lighting, and what I've decided to do is have some sort of hangar doors that are partially opened. I suppose I'm thinking that this might be where the robot initially emerged from its sort of manufacturing facility, but that was a long time ago and this has since become overgrown and sort of become derelict. So what I'm going to do is have these pieces of acrylic sheet here which are cut to size, and they're going to give the appearance of some sort of partially open hangar doors. Now what I've done is to build up some terrain using some polystyrene here, and what I've typically done in previous builds is to use some plaster just to sort of smooth out all of that detail and get a sort of a sloping look to the terrain. And the problem with that though is that plaster can be a little bit brittle and it can break, so what I want to do is do something a little bit stronger. So what I'm doing here is mixing up some polyester resin, and I'm mixing in some plaster into this instead. Now this dries really, really hard, so this is a really good way of coming up with something that's really, really durable. So you can just keep adding plaster to this until it becomes a paste, then you can just put that on with a spatula in a similar way that you would for a regular plaster. Right, so I've let that dry, and what I've now done is to come in with some PVA glue to act as an adhesive. What I'm doing is just pouring on a mixture of grout and sand, and this is the same method I've used in previous builds. And this is just going to simulate some earth and mud. So some further detail that I've added to the base here is some snow effects, and these were actually sent to me by a company called Precision Snow and Ice, and they actually sent these to me at the beginning of 2020. Now I did say at the time it might take a little bit of time for me to actually come up with a project where these would be appropriate, but unfortunately it has taken me rather a long time, much longer than I actually intended, so sorry about that, but I finally got around to using them. I figured this would be quite a good idea for this project, because I have the concept of the robot sort of running hot with a very hot reactor. I thought it would be a cool way to demonstrate that idea by having the snow around the robot melt. So what I'm doing is adding snow to the base, but I'm leaving the areas around the robot's feet bare, and the idea being that the snow has melted away where the robot stood. Now I've already had a bit of a test with some of the snow products on the side of the base here, so what I'm going to do is continue doing that, but before I do that I need to add some vegetation that the snow is going to cover. I'm then adding some additional thin down PVA glue. I'm just putting some of this sort of mix of flocking on as well, so it's just a mixture of various textures which together look like a sort of a woodland base, so I'm just putting them on as well to add some additional detailing. And what I've also got is some additional sticks and things from the garden just to add some additional detail. Now for the snow, what I've done, I'm not sure if this is how you're supposed to do it, but I've got some of their adhesive and I've mixed it together with some of the really fine snow powder, and I'm using that as a sort of a base. Then I'm just coming in with some of the thicker snow grains and I'm just sort of sprinkling those on, and I think that gives a really nice texture, so I'm really impressed with this stuff. I think particularly the adhesive they've got, it's very thin and it dries very quickly, so a lot of this snow stuff I literally did in about 10 minutes, and it was sort of stuck together pretty solidly after about, I don't know, 15 or 20 minutes. So yeah, really good stuff, so I'm really impressed with that. Now this isn't a sponsored video or anything, but if you are interested, this is their web address, and I've found these really easy to use, so I can see myself using them on other projects as well. Now, as I mentioned, I wanted to have the appearance of the snow having melted around the robot's feet. So what I'm doing is coming in with some Mod Podge, which is like a gloss medium. I'm just brushing that over the ground around the robot. I'm hoping this will give like a wet effect to make it look like the snow has melted. So I've let that dry, and I think that looks pretty cool, but I'm thinking maybe it needs to look a little bit wetter. So what I've decided to do is actually mix up some clear resin. Now I've used this stuff previously on previous videos, and what I've often done is to pressure cast it, and that's fine if you're actually casting a single sort of discrete item. But if you're pouring onto a base, obviously I can't pressure cast this, so what I've actually decided to do is to take the two pieces of the resin and actually put them in some hot water. The idea here is that it makes the liquid less viscous, and that should then allow any air trapped in the resin to escape before I pour it onto the model. So I'm just mixing these two pieces up. They've been sitting in the hot water for a while, and they're definitely much less viscous than they were previously. So as you can see, I've mixed this up, but that's introduced some bubbles into the mix. So what I'm going to do is put that back in the warm water and leave it for a little bit just to allow the air to escape again. So I've left that for about 20 minutes or so, and as you can see there are far fewer air bubbles in it than there were previously. So it looks pretty good, so I'm now going to come on and actually pour this onto the model. So I think the hot water has actually caused this to cure much quicker than it normally would, which isn't too much of a problem, but it has made me rush a little bit. But there we go, I think that's looking pretty cool. Right, so as you can see I've got some of the electronics working here. What I've done is to thread a cable up the leg of the robot and sort of actually include that into the details. So I've used some of the cable clips, which are just small beads that I've used previously. So it looks like this is actually part of the robot, but these are actually live cables. I guess that's one of the useful things with robots. You can actually hide any cables you're actually using in the design and they won't be too obvious. So all of the wiring is coming up to the central portion in the middle of the robot. And what I've got is some breadboard here, and all I'm doing is connecting the positives to one strip and the negatives to the other. Now, this was rather a complicated process. The problem with it, of course, is that once I start wiring everything up, it means that I can't then disassemble the robot afterwards. So I need to think quite carefully as to whether I needed to do anything else to the robot prior to wiring it up, because once I'd done that, it didn't give me much leeway to then start taking pieces back off again if I wanted to go and add some additional detailing or paintwork or anything like that. So this took a little bit of time. It was quite a fiddly process, so I didn't film a lot of it, but as you can see, we've now got a bunch of LEDs going on here, and you can see there's a lot of them centered in the chest, and the idea there, I think I mentioned before, is that this is kind of a hot reactor, and so there's a lot of orange LEDs there to try and communicate that idea. I started thinking that maybe the white ones weren't quite right. I want to communicate the idea that this robot's running hot, so I'm thinking actually maybe I should be using orange ones all the way throughout. So I actually ended up swapping out the ones in the leg for some orange LEDs instead. I think it actually looks a lot better. So for the hanger in the base, I wanted to have some light sort of streaming out to illuminate the mech from below, and I found with previous projects that blue goes really well with orange, so I tend to use that combination quite a lot, and that's just done with a bunch of these LED strip lights which I've attached underneath. Now I appreciate I've not gone into a lot of detail with the lighting for this one, and that's really just because it's stuff I've done before in previous videos, so I didn't want to repeat myself by going over the same old territory. So if you are interested in how all of this is done, then please do check out some of my previous mech videos, and I've also got a separate video dedicated to adding LED lighting to models, so I'll put the link in the description for anyone who's interested. Well, so there we go, one demon robot. Now, I think I did say at the end of the last video that I wouldn't be able to post this for a while because the competition hasn't yet ended. Actually, turns out that I'm allowed to do that, so this is why this is now live before the end of the competition. I have to say it's difficult to actually sort of have an opinion on this for me personally, because I've been working on this for so long. It's difficult to sort of step back and be objective. You know, you get so embedded in these projects, it's a bit difficult to sort of you know, see the wood for the trees, as it were. So I think this looks cool. I hope it does. You know, it's quite complicated, and obviously it's taken quite a long time to put together. But I think that's it for this video. So if you have got to the end of this, thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Thanks very much for watching. I'll be posting videos on future projects, so if you'd like to keep up with what's going on, please do subscribe. Alternatively, you can visit my website, which is www.thedarkpower.com, or you can find me on Facebook, just search for The Dark Power.